I'm always so grateful that we can share this time together. I personally enjoy it. If for nothing else, it puts it on the schedule for me to actually focus on studying the Tao, specifically studying a part time to do that. And I'm happy to be able to um, do this, once a week or so, or almost every week. And so today's uh, presentation will be day 44 of the Tao of Joy Every Day, internal and external reflections. And the subtitle I chose is "What is reflected out will reflect back." And in a way, as I was putting this together, even though I didn't specifically mention it in the presentation, and I'll take the time to, now that I'm thinking of it, to say it now, it's a lot like karma in a way. And what we put out, good or bad, tends to reflect back to us. And obviously, as Tao cultivators, we would like to reflect positive things, good things, not negative things. And a big part of that, our preparing, our learning to do that, or becoming skilled at doing that, is to turn inward and be able to have sort of an honest examination of ourselves and what we do and say. But because if you think about it, that really is what either gets us into trouble or gets us through things smoothly, is what we do and say. We set up our lives, and it's our actions and words, our communications really, both verbal and nonverbal, that set up how we come across to others. And it's important to be cognizant of that, and to also to understand that no one's perfect, that we all make mistakes. And hopefully I can explain this idea in a little bit more detail, the way Derek did in his excellent chapter on the subject. But first, as always, I'll do a quick review of what we did a couple of weeks ago, which was the natural order, and that was day 43. And speaking of the natural order, as I said at the end of the summary, as a question we might pose to ourselves is, how can we align ourselves with the natural order of the Tao? Obviously, the Tao progresses in a natural order. We see that in the cycles of the season. We see that in night and day and so forth. But we also have to understand that ideally, human activities should have appropriate times and specific orders for their occurrences too, in order for things to go smoothly. And sometimes we don't do that. We put the cart before the horse. We want something so badly, or our emotion clouds things, that we step out of the natural order. And so we often really do have to make an effort to ensure that we're not putting the cart before the horse, that we're doing things at the right times, and we're not trying to take on things that we're not ready to do. You have to be honest with yourself. And it ties in well with today's chapter of self-reflection and knowing yourself in order to really progress, spiritually or in any other way as well. Because, the Tao and life itself encompasses everything, not just the spiritual, but there's a physical component too, and a mental component that all comes into play. And so the reason it's important to learn this lesson is because it helps us to understand that everything in life has an optimal time for its occurrence, including our own death. And at the end of my talk last week, Derek told that wonderful story that I think most of us have probably heard before, about the Chinese calligrapher and his writing of the order of things. Something like I think it was grandfather dies, you die, son dies, grandchildren die, and everyone sort of said, "Well, what's that? That sounds really depressing." And then the person pointed out, "Well, yeah, but there's a natural order to things. When things come out of that natural order, that's when you have tragedy." And I've always remembered that story even before Derek brought it up, because it's so simple, and yet it's so far-reaching in its depth of things. Death is something that we all have to accept because it's coming, like it or not. It's part of the human condition. And I don't think we're going to become like jellyfish, where we can live forever. I guess there's certain species of jellyfish that can rejuvenate. But even that, I remember a physicist talking about how he was talking to a geneticist about, what they're doing and how they're trying to make people age backwards, like on Mork and Mindy. And he said, well, does that mean we're not going to die? And his friend told him, well, you and I will probably die, but I wouldn't make any bets on our children's children. The scientist said something like that. And of course, he laughed. He said, because as a physicist, I know that even if we did find a way to live forever, we got a sun up there that's going to swell up in about 2 billion years, and the temperature of this planet's going to be unlivable. So death, even if we somehow medically overcame medical death, it would be hard to eliminate oblivion. And like Derek has taught many times, nothing lasts forever, including us. Even if we achieve some incredible scientific discovery in the field of medicine, it's still not a guarantee that. I don't know if there is any guarantee. There's no way that we're not each going to face death at some point. And hopefully we'll learn enough while living and processing through life that we learn how to face it with grace and poise. And of course, it's important to learn this lesson really as soon as you can, because no one knows when they're going to die. So the sooner we come to grips with our own death, the more prepared we are to live life to the fullest, I think. Okay, and so lastly, when we understand the natural order of life, we can begin to remove our fears about death and focus on living, learning, and loving at the appropriate times and in the appropriate sequences as we work towards fulfilling our destinies. We must live our lives to the fullest, so that when it is time for us to pass away, we can do it with grace and poise. So that's a wrap up of day 43. And so now on to day 44. And in this chapter, Derek starts out by pointing out something in chapter 71 of the Tao of Joy that's often mistranslated. And he goes on to say that it's mistranslated as follows. And the mistranslation is something like this: the sage is sick of being sick. And so what I wanted to do, now that I've brought up the mistranslation that Derek mentioned, is to go to the actual chapter, which this is from Derek's version of the Tao of Joy, annotated and explained, and to read what it actually says by someone who knows Chinese and ancient Chinese in a deep way and can translate it accurately. So here it goes. To know that you do not know is the highest. To know but think you know is flawed. Only when one recognizes the fault as a fault can one be without fault. The sages are without fault because they recognize the fault as a fault. That is why they are without fault. Now, it's a short chapter, but it's really interesting. And the thing I wanted to bring out is the reason why the mistranslation is somewhat egregious is because the word sickness implies like physical sickness, like being physically sick, which I can relate to pretty well right now with this earache. but seriously, physical sickness, I mean, there's not much you can do about physical sickness. We're all going to get sick one day. If you live long enough and don't get hit by a bus, we're all going to get sick one day. It's kind of inevitable. And there's nothing we can really do about that. It's part of facing a life's process. We age, we get older. That's just the biological reality for the moment anyway. And, it's something that we're all going to have to deal with. But that's not what this is talking about. This is talking about our internal faults. And it's not, one of the things that Derek points out in this chapter, it's not that sages haven't messed up or had faults or flaws or little idiosyncrasies that I think all human beings have. The difference is they're detached from it, and they can honestly examine themselves and see when something's not right. And, and once you know something isn't right, well, then you can correct it. And that's what sages do. And over time, they self-examine and correct and self-examine and correct. And eventually it just comes to the point, I think when you're a sage, you're the last to know you're a sage, and you eliminate these flaws, which is why he says that's why they're without fault, because they take the time to focus inward, to be honest with themselves about their own behavior, their own biases, their own words and actions that may not be quite in line with the Tao, and they constantly work to refine themselves so that they are in line with the Tao in every way, not just what they say, but what they do, and not just what they say, but how they say it. Because often, how you say it is arguably more important than what you say sometimes. You could say something that seems perfectly in line when you look at it on paper, but if you say it with the wrong voice inflections or with sarcasm or something like that, you can really cause harm to other people. mainly we do this with our mouth, but there's a whole host of nonverbal things that come into play as well that can affect things in a negative way. And we have to be honest with ourselves about when we mess up so that we can fix it. Because like I said, you can't fix a problem unless you know it's a problem. And the only way you can know, unless you're going to wait for someone to tell you, hey, you got to knock it off, you're nuts, you look what you're doing, which most people won't have the honesty to do with you anyways. So it's really up to you to sort of be self-reflective and honest about your own behavior when you can. Now, there are some things in our behavior that other people can see that we just can't. But the idea is to work to where even those things are good. And I personally believe, as a matter of faith, that if you practice self-reflection and refinement of Tao cultivation long enough, it will become second nature. It hasn't for me yet by any means, but like all of us, I think we're all works in progress. So now to some of the specific points I wanted to make that to sort of summarize what Derek expressed so well in the chapter, which, as always, I encourage you to read if you're able to. So self-reflection is, of course, an important thing for Tao cultivators to master. It's crucial for us to turn inward and review our words and actions on a regular basis. If for no other reason than what I said earlier, when a problem arises in our behavior, we have to be aware of it in order to fix it. You can't fix something that you don't know is a problem. And if you never turn inward and if you never analyze your own behavior and how it's affecting others, words and actions specifically, you can't recognize when you've made an error, and you can't then correct, if possible, the problem in the present. And you also won't be able to prevent similar issues in the future. You'll just keep making the same mistakes because you're not aware that the mistakes are mistakes. And it seems so obvious when I say it, but think about how hard it is, right? It's hard to be honest about ourselves with our own flaws. I mean, it's human nature to take it easy on ourselves. And so, important thing I often remember is that little trick that Derek taught us, which is the Chinese coin, right? You want to be soft toward the world, but rigid with yourself. And that's, a big part of self-reflection is turning inward and being honest, brutally honest sometimes, about your own shortcomings. I mean, at the same time, you don't want to beat yourself up too badly, but you want to be critical enough to see what you're doing wrong so that you can fix it, so that you can grow, so that you can become better. I mean, that's really why we're here, to bring out our best selves that are already there, in a way. So, and then, of course, once this honest examination of our own performance with regard to interacting with others has been completed, well, then we have to be able to jump into action. It's not enough just to know that you recognize your faults and you then just sit and do nothing. You have to change it. I mean, you hear this a lot. People will say, hey, I'm not the kind of guy who's very organized or something like that. And it's almost like they say it proudly, right? They'll list some flaw and go, that's who I am, and darn it, I like that I'm that way. That's the attitude sometimes that comes off of the people. But really, there's more to it than just turning inward and being aware of your fault. It's recognizing that your fault is wrong, it's bad, it's negative, and to be able to work to change it. Because, it's with anything in life, you reap what you sow. You have to, if you want something, if you want to achieve something, you have to be able to work at it. And I know there's sort of this idea in the Tao, achieve without striving. And yeah, I mean, I understand what that means, at the high level and everything. But again, like I said, I think oftentimes sages are the last ones to know they're sages because it's just second nature. And until we get to that point, which we may not even know when we are, then I think we have to be conscious about what we do and say and to fix it. Recently ongoing, I should say, on our Facebook page, people discuss the coaching ritual and vegetarianism. And what I've noticed, and when I've heard lots of discussions over the years on this, and I've participated in them out of curiosity when I was learning about it and so forth. And it's always sort of, people tend to focus on the dietary aspects of it, which, that's one component of it. But, the main part of the coaching ritual is the cleansing of the mouth, and more specifically, it's what comes out of our mouth more than what we put in it. What we say and do to others, that's the thing that's really the thing that's important to master, is how we treat others, how we come off, how our attitude is. I mean, the attitude is everything, and a lot of it comes into, our physical body position as we say things, our tone of voice, and in addition, of course, what we actually say. And so it's important to be cognizant of how big an impact that is. I mean, in a way, that's really the coaching ritual at the deep level. It's this commitment to using appropriate words and actions to do what's right, what's in line with the Tao. So, I mean, that's the spirit of it. And yes, I don't want to minimize the other component of it. I know plenty of people see it as an expression of compassion, which it is towards other beings, even beings, for lack of a better word, further down the food chain than we are, at least as it's perceived. And yeah, that's a component of it. I don't want to take away from anyone who does it for that reason. But to me, what I learned from Bill and from Derek, especially with Bill, because I talked specifically with him about this over the years, the important part is the behavior of what we say, cleaning our mouth, cleaning what comes out of our mouth. That's really so important too. And sometimes the vegetarian aspect, people, I think, tend to focus on it too much, and then we lose sight of the real deepness of it. So I wanted to bring that up because it fits in well, I think, with this idea of, internal reflection of what we're doing, what we're putting out. It always, of course, starts within and works out, inside out, so to speak. So to achieve success in this area of Tao cultivation, of self-reflection, we can't assume that we're right, and that because our intentions may be good or are good, genuinely good, that we're not responsible for the strife that has been created. And let's face it, we've all done it. We'll, I'm sure, continue to do it. We sure didn't mean to be negative or come off a certain way, but and sometimes we know right away, like as soon as you say it. Bill famously and other people famously said, when you say something that you wish you hadn't have said, and you realize it as you're saying it, and it's referred to right as like that oh no moment, or that oh no second, or oh no, what did I just say? That can happen to us. We may not intend to come off a certain way, but we realize sometimes even as we're doing it, that that didn't come off the way I wanted it to. And it's important to review that and to understand, how can I fix this so I don't make that same mistake again? And if I did cause hurt this time, is there anything I can do to sort of repair the damage I've done here? And sometimes there may not be, but you should at least see if you can, and if you can, try to take some action to correct the things, whether that's apologizing or correcting it in some other manner. So remember, the problems that we encounter in our relationships can practically always be turned back to our own behavior. I mean, if I'm honest with myself, if I look at the problems I've had in relationships, whether they be business relationships or personal relationships or any kind of relationship, if I'm honest about it, I can recognize where I've set this up. This bad situation happened because me not seeing something soon enough to correct it, or just outright being wrong, despite the fact that I have good intentions. I mean, generally speaking, I could say, I'm a pretty good person. I've generally always had good intentions, and I think we all could probably say that. I'm sure everyone in this meeting is a decent, good person with, the best hopes to do what's right. But that's not. There's more to it than just wanting to do it right. You actually have to do it right. And that's really what this chapter is, at least the first part, which I've covered so far, the internal reflection. I haven't said much about the external reflection, but it's coming. And so it's important to remember that it's like I said at the top of the talk, it's like karma in a way. What we put out is what reflects back to us. So, and remember, of course, that behavior can be both verbal and nonverbal. Just because you're saying something right, in terms of the words, maybe what you're saying is correct or spot on. How you say it can often have a bigger impact on people than even what you say. Yeah, and it's important to be aware of that and to try to evaluate how you're doing that. And a big part of being able to know that you're messing up is listening more than talking. Listening to how your communications are being received. And it takes practice to listen, because we all want to talk in a way. Our egos are always trying to drive us to talk. But listening is a very important part of getting feedback from others on how you're doing. So again, so that we can correct things that are flawed and eliminate our faults as much as possible and move forward. So, ultimately, the external part, the last part of this chapter, is ultimately what radiates out from within us will always reflect back to us. So if we not only intend to be good, but actually put out some goodness here and there, and it doesn't have to be consciously contrived, but, it'll naturally come, that goodness tends to come back to us. And it can work against you too. I mean, if you put out a lot of negativity, and even if you don't know you're doing it, you can end up having a lot of negativity reflect back on you until you do stop and take an internal stock of what you're doing, and recognizing that it's wrong and working to correct it. And so I wanted to bring out the Western Judeo-Christian sentiment of this idea might be a phrase that I'm sure we've all heard. The road to hell is paved with good intentions. Oftentimes it's when we're wanting to do so good that we mess up, and that's why the Tao, so much of it is a focus of, not that you don't ever do anything to try to bring goodness about, but that you don't do it with a heavy hand, that you learn to do it gently. And, let's be honest, sometimes only by messing up and doing it with a heavy hand, by interfering and paying the consequences, that we learn, hey, wait, that's wrong. I need to start looking at that. I need to start working to fix that. And so I wanted to put this Western sentiment in, because I think it's an important thing to remember, because as I'll bring up in a couple of minutes in the summary, not recognizing that we're doing something wrong it's very akin to cognitive dissonance, right? Which is something we heard a lot politically now, where people get locked into a political point of view. And I'm not going to bring up any specific one, but we know there's tons of hot button wedge issues that come up in life. And some people just get married to their position, so much so to the point where they just can't conceive that they might be wrong, or maybe not as right as they tend to think that they are. That's a trap that we can fall into, not only with things like politics and other things, but with our own behavior, our own self-evaluation. We have to be aware that it's not good enough just to want to do good. You actually have to do good. And you actually have to be aware when you're not. You have to be honest, sometimes brutally honest, with how you're not measuring up, so that one day we can measure up. And I think that's very important. So I'm going to start to sum up what I've said here now. Tao sages are individuals who cultivate the Tao in a highly skilled way. They achieve the success by turning inward and being honest about their own faults. Because they engage in this inward reflection, they're able to address any faults that they find within themselves and correct their own flaws to the point where they've eliminated them over time. That's the goal, right? To constantly engage in self-reflection to the point where, one, you just know sooner that you're messing up, which allows you to correct sooner. And then to the point where you know yourself so well that you know to avoid the pitfalls that you may have a natural inclination to sometimes. Knowing yourself well is the key to winning the battle. Knowing yourself is probably one of the most important things. It's good to know others as well. That's an important part of being skillful, understanding others. And that, of course, as I said, comes through listening. But it's important to know yourself well too, because you're the person who you have full control over. And so you have to know yourself so that you can correct whatever needs to be corrected, possibly. So remember that after the self-examination is completed, it's a good practice to accept responsibility for our behaviors, and if possible, to take action to correct any problems that we've created, so that we can avoid repeating those previous errors in our future encounters with others. And like I said too, if it's possible if you recognize that you've made a mistake and caused some damage, if possible, you should try to see what you can do to repair that damage. And sometimes the reality is you can't. Sometimes you can't unring a bell and what's done is done, and you have to sort of move on, but hope you at least learn from it so that something good comes of it, in the sense that, you turn your failure into success because you learn what you did wrong that caused you to fail, and then you avoid it in the future. That's a valuable lesson. That's often hard won. And like I always say, failure is a good thing in the Tao worldview, because, what we try to do is we try to not let failure leave us until we've learned everything we can from it. And of course, internal reflection is a big part of that. So we must not get stuck in the trap of being oblivious to our own faults, or to think that because our intentions are good, we don't have to be responsible for the negative situations that we manifest sometimes. It's easy to have blind spots when it comes to our own behavior. It's very natural to want to think the best of ourselves, and to see flaws in others very easily, but not so much in ourselves. But Tao cultivators realize that's an error, and that you do have to turn inward and be honest with yourself so that you can correct our problems, because no one's perfect. Well, I think maybe sages are probably perfect, but again, to me, I wonder if even sages even know that they're sages. They just, because it's so natural and uncontrived, their good behavior just spill. It comes from the wellspring of the Tao naturally, so it's not contrived, or there's not sort of this purposeful, intentional effort to do it. It just comes naturally. A point that one day I would hope to get to, as I'm sure we all would. So this attitude of thinking that because our intentions are good, that we can't go wrong, or that we being blind to our own faults, like I said, is similar to cognitive dissonance, and it'll keep us from reflecting positivity. However, the good news is, if we do in fact do the hard work of turning inward to become aware of our faults and being honest, and that can be painful, I won't lie to you, we can correct our shortcomings. And this will create positive achievement, which will reflect out of us and onto the world. And quite naturally, that will be reflected back to us. So the key is to cultivate awareness. And in the Tao, when it comes to Tao cultivation, awareness is such a big component. You have to know what's going on. And that's what that whole internal turning inward is about. It's about internal self-awareness of what we're constantly reflecting out, being aware of it. Being aware of what we're doing to the world, because we all affect the world in our way. And sometimes it's easy to sit there and go, well, we're just this little meaningless creature on this tiny little planet, and this, regular, ordinary galaxy, and we're off in this little corner of it. But it matters to us what we do and say to each other. And I think while there may be limits to the physical world, I think the spiritual world is endless. The physical world may be endless too, but in terms of the universe. But it's important to be aware of what we're reflecting out, so that we can work to reflect what we're meant to reflect out. We're meant to reflect out our true selves. So as always, I'll end with an invitation. If you've learned from the Tao teachings, perhaps you'll be open to sharing what you've learned with others by presenting on a topic, or sharing the insights you've learned with other people in your community, or in our Tao community. That has the potential to not only help others, but to deepen your own understanding as well. The Dalai Lama often says that altruistic people are the most selfish, right? Because in a way, because what they know about positive karma, and it's sort of a funny play on words that he talks about, but the idea that someone who's very giving is actually very selfish because they understand the karmic mechanism. I don't know if that's such a spot on thing to say, but it always, when he says it, always catches my attention. And so, as always, I'll end with a book recommendation: The Tao of Joy Every Day, a great book to use daily to help one study and learn the Tao teachings and put them into action. So there it was, internal and external reflections, day 44. What is reflected out will reflect back. So I want to thank all of you for giving me the opportunity to speak with you today. I hope I said something that was helpful, and I hope you all have a wonderful Sunday.
Alex, thank you so much. I know you are still not 100% health-wise, so I especially appreciate you making an extra effort to present today.
My pleasure, sir.
And, it's fortuitous that this particular page from the book talks about chapter 71 of the Tao Te Ching. I'm actually quite sure that most of the people listening now has a translation of that chapter 71 that says the sage is sick of being sick, and that's why he is not sick. So and that's completely, that's such a bad translation, and it's not true. You know, uh, just to be funny, I might turn that around and say, Alex, aren't you sick of being sick? Well, if you are, then you won't be sick. Not true.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, I was gonna say, who isn't sick of being sick when they're sick? That's pretty easy thing to do. And the other thing I wanted to say is, even sages have to die. So yeah,
Yeah.
and if you live long enough and don't get hit by a bus, you're gonna get sick. It's inevitable.
Yeah, it's sort of yeah, on the one hand, it's sort of like saying, oh, you can decide to not be sick just by being sick of being sick, and that's unfortunately not how things work. It's actually pretty insulting to the people who are battling serious illness, or it's a way of denying reality. Like, I'm not sick, I'm not sick, I'm not sick. When you're actually suffering from an actual illness. So the
Yeah.
reason why it's a poor translation is because there's actually no Mandarin expression anywhere in any dialect in any time in history that's sick of being sick. The closest you can get in Mandarin would be something like, I've had enough of being sick, or I've suffered enough from being sick, something like that. And you would say like, 我受够了, 我受够了. I've had enough, or I've suffered enough of being sick, and that's the closest equivalence to I'm sick and tired of being sick. So the original never said that, as you expressed today. It's talking about reflection. The sage is aware of a fault as a fault, and therefore that's how the sage can be without fault. It's a really a simple idea. It's basically saying that awareness of the problem is half the battle. So suddenly, from this ridiculous statement, the sage is sick of being sick, suddenly it turns into a practical truth. You have to be aware of the problems, especially when those problems are your own. Simply being aware is very powerful. And the issue for us is that many people are simply unaware, or lacking in self-awareness. So feedback for you, Alex. Thanks, Alex, from Tim. As far as self-reflection is concerned, how can you identify the line between productive self-criticism and beating yourself up too much? That's an excellent question.
Well, yeah, it is an excellent question. You don't want to beat yourself up too much. I mean, there are people who just solely focus on what they're doing wrong, and they never give themselves any credit for anything. As with anything in life, it's a balance that has to be struck, and it takes wisdom and experience to do that. But sages don't criticize themselves in a negative way. They criticize them with an eye toward improvement, and I think that can really be the difference. Honest improvement means that you accept constructive criticism and you know what to be constructive about. So I think it just takes time and experience, and we all learn as we go to some degree.
Yes, indeed. And I do think that it's one of the difficult topics to actually cultivate in one's life. And I say that because I have seen the lack of awareness hit all kinds of people at different levels of understanding, cultivation, education, level of intelligence, etc. I do know people who are, really smart and yet completely, as an example, completely unaware of how bad they look when they engage in a debate. They have no idea how much of their ego they are showing, how rude they seem to other people. Now, I'm aware of that because I gotta confess, I was in that same boat. When I used to engage in debates, I really thought that it came across as intelligent, scholarly, and humorous. Little did I realize that other people saw me not as intelligent, scholarly, and humorous, but as arrogant, out of touch, and certainly not as funny as I thought I was. So it took a lot of reflection, not beating myself up, but just reflecting on the things that people would say, the reaction to me, for me to come upon the conclusion that, okay, I should probably stop doing that because, frankly, I did it to gratify my ego. So in a real sense, my internal reflection was the way for me to cultivate my self-awareness. And I always love this word, reflection. I love the dual meaning of this word. Reflection can be that image in a mirror, basically light bouncing off that reflective surface. And it can also mean contemplation, serious thinking. And it can be reflecting upon yourself as you see your own reflection in the mirror, of course. So go ahead, sorry.
I just wanted to mention something because you bringing that up made me think of something that I didn't talk about specifically in this talk, but I thought of as I was putting it together. And that's, of course, the sixth patriarch and the beautiful poem about reflection of what's there and, the dust motes and all of that. And I thought of that a little. I couldn't quite think of how to weave it into this particular topic, but it was something that definitely crossed my mind because I love that story of, the poem and the beautifulness of, the true nature is there, and how fortunate we are to be able to share with each other, as we do in this meeting every week or most weeks.